we are just beginning to totally understand food and everything that it contains. We track, 13 nutrients on a label. There's like 100 nutrients in our database.
Beef contains an estimated 30,000 unique metabolites, and these are things like taurine, anserine, creatine.
Let's talk about the Beef Nutrient Density Project.
What we're working on a lot is tracking the flow of those nutrients from the plant and sometimes even the soil into the animal and into the human. But another interesting finding is that grass fed isn't grass fed isn't grass fed, and grain fed isn't grain fed either. So it's that the data suggests that these are in fact are grain fed beef labeled as beef. And vice versa. Actually, maybe this might be surprising to some people. Some grain fed samples were more nutrient dense than the least nutrient dense grass fed samples. Yeah, I don't know why people would say that it's not that important. If you eat grass fed beef and grain fed beef, your blood is going to look different afterwards because of the different compounds.
All of the pioneering work you're doing, I think it's some of the most important work of our time. Hi everyone, I'm very excited about today's interview because it's a researcher I admire and have actually worked with who is creating some of the most impactful research around protein. Does the quality of protein matter? Does the system from which protein comes from matter? Can we use animals in ways that improve environmental and human health? Dr. Van Vliet over here, he's got all the answers. We've worked on a project together. I can tell you he's as good a person as he is researcher, very nuanced. There's not going to be any dogmatic, super crazy and kind of like one viewpoint answers coming from him. He's balanced, he's practiced, and I'm just really excited to have you on the show. So thanks for making time for me, Dr. Van Vliet.
Yeah, no, you're welcome, Adam, and thanks for that wonderful introduction.
Yeah, we had a lot of fun. The minute I learned about your research, I thought, oh, well, this is the guy answering the questions that people need to understand. And so I had to beg you to let me be a part of the Beef Nutrient Density Project, which we'll talk about soon. But first, I want you to introduce yourself. Tell people, where are you working? What is your specialty? And just how did you become so interested in this protein and regenerative agriculture research?
So yeah, I direct the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University, and we have really two major pillars of our work. One is nutrient density profiling, where we use advanced mass spec-based techniques to look at not just protein and fat and vitamins and minerals in food, but also look at a much broader array of nutrients, also which people typically refer to as phytonutrients. Basically the stuff that does not appear in nutrition facts panel, but we're learning is pretty important for your health because a lot of them are antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, flavor compounds. So we do a lot of food nutrient density profiling. And then the other pillar of our work is we also have a clinical facility and a metabolic kitchen where we perform human nutrition trials out of. So besides profiling the food, and we often profile foods from different production systems, or we may profile plant-based meat alternatives and meat, and then we feed people those foods as well, and then take their stool, their urine, their blood, and then also see if there's an appreciable effect on their health. And really looking at what we're working on a lot is tracking the flow of those nutrients from the plant and sometimes even the soil into the animal and into the human, whether depending on whether it's plants for direct human consumption or we consume animal source foods from animals that consume the wide variety of different plants and where we're out on pasture. So those are the main two pillars of this work. And my background is really in sports nutrition and muscle, human muscle biology. So that's how I started with earlier protein work, looking at muscle protein synthesis in response, mainly a focus on whole foods. And I think that's where this interest came in the complexity of foods, because a lot of work prior to that had been done with protein shakes, but that's not how we eat protein. We eat eggs and meat and black bean burgers and drink milk and things such as that, right? So we've done a lot of work in that area. And then at some point, I got kind of rolled into regenerative agriculture, and I'm happy to give more of the tell that story. But it wasn't per se on my mind at that time, even though I had a personal interest growing up in the Netherlands. Around we always get our milk directly from the farm. We'd go to farmers markets, and at that time I didn't think anything of it, but I think that subconsciously cultivated this interest in the quality of food and working together with farmers is what a lot of what we do.
Yeah, and we have so many directions to go. And like you said, you're doing the human trials that are saying, do these differences in quality, do the phytonutrients, do the omega-3s, do they matter when you actually eat the food? So we're going to get to that. But first, because people do eat a lot of protein powders today, and your research showed why that's a little bit different. So can you just touch on that? What was the difference between a protein powder and maybe eating an egg? Why does that matter?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not to say that I'm against eating protein powder, right? Because
Right.
it's a supplement, so it's not that it doesn't have a role, but I do think it should be treated as that in the majority of your foods should come from whole foods. The reason why I think that is because when you eat whole foods, you're not just getting protein, you're getting probably thousands of other compounds that can also impact the muscle protein synthetic response. For instance, what we did was one study where we compared whole eggs versus egg whites, matched for protein content. And the leading thought was, well, you have to eat egg whites after you exercise because it absorbs faster, the muscle protein synthetic response is faster. But what we found was actually that whole eggs, even though their digestion and absorption, so the peak at which you see the amino acids appear in the blood, is a little bit later, only half an hour or so, not that much later, but is that you got a stronger muscle anabolic response. And it is probably because of the bioactive compounds that are found within egg yolks. That was at least our hypothesis. And then if you look through the literature, you can find that certain vitamins and certain other carotenoids they can act on muscle protein synthetic pathways, on signaling pathways, and it can actually increase that signal. And as a result, you may have a stronger muscle protein synthetic response. So that's the benefit of whole foods. And typically, it's that while we unfortunately have dumped those foods down to protein and fat and carbs, right? You're actually getting this complex matrix that has effects independent of just the protein, and it may, like I said, have signaling molecules in there that can help with the muscle protein synthetic response. And the same thing is true for other pathways. We know that some of the polyphenols, for instance, can impact glucose uptake in the muscle independent of insulin.
Mm.
So those are all very beneficial things, of course, especially when diabetes is quite rampant and pre-diabetes within our society.
I can't wait to get into the phytonutrients. I think that's one of the most important pieces of what you're doing. But something I've learned from you that I think will help people is that, we are just beginning to totally understand food and everything that it contains. We track, 13 nutrients on a food level label. There's like 100 nutrients in our databases. But I think in our experiment, this is from Fred Provenza. You didn't confirm this. I think there's like 40,000 compounds just in beef. And you're able to do this and track this because there's been advances in something called metabolomics. So can you just speak to that for a second? How are you able
Yeah,
to make these new discovereries?
that's right. So traditionally, people have looked at indeed um, a handful of nutrients, as you said, appear in Nutrition Facts Panel. The USDA nutrient reference database tracks routinely about 120 compounds, so things like fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, um, as well as some potentially bioactive compounds. But foods, like you said, beef contains an estimated 30,000 unique metabolites, and these are things like taurine, anserine, creatine, and a wide variety of others as well. And I wish I could say we can profile 40,000 compounds. We can't, but at least we were able to bring this profiling up from maybe like 60 to 80 to 100 compounds to at least close to 1,000 compounds now. So it's about a tenfold increase. So it's an order of magnitude, but I am also thinking that we're still scratching the surface. But even though we've made leaps and bounds in understanding the complexity of foods, first we were at the top, and now we're descending, right? And we're still got a long way to go before we reach the valley again.
Yeah, and that's what I say was the most interesting part about working with you is like you are a true pioneer. Like you're kind of setting the standards and then making sure all the references are met. I mean, like you just the amount of work it takes to be a pioneer and just like rearranging and innovating and learning and adapting. And I was just thoroughly impressed by what you're able to accomplish over there. So I want to get into protein quality, obviously, but first I want to say, so there's a big push around protein in general. You're a protein researcher. I've had an interesting conversation with Tracy Anderson the other day where she was on this panel for Oprah and people were having this heated debate about you have to eat protein, you have to stuff yourself. Even if you don't want to eat protein, even if it doesn't feel good, just eat the protein. And her argument was like, no, we need to listen to our bodies. And, so what do you think? Like, I know we probably need to increase protein. I'm an advocate of that. But what do you think of these kind of like battles people are having?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to that black and white, like and saying like you have to stuff yourself, even if you're then probably that's not the case. That's a little too extreme. But you should make a cognizant effort to eat enough protein. Yeah, and we notice especially when people get older,
Mm.
their muscle tissue is less responsive to the amino acids. So eating more protein has definitely been, I would say, proven in 20 years of research that one can benefit from eating higher protein intakes, especially at older age. Also, of course, when you exercise, we know that there's an increased need for dietary protein. So, yes, if you're not eating enough, we have to definitely say that's the case. Now we know that in the US, people do exceed the RDA a bit, but the RDA is considered. I don't think any protein researcher in the field thinks the RDA is adequate. So
Yep.
there's a lot of suggestion that maybe 1.5 times the RDA, which is about what the average American eat, but you can find people that obviously do not eat enough. But I would say yes, it is something to be aware of and to be focused on. I would always say also protein has effects beyond just, it's also one of the most satiating macronutrients. So personally, when I eat a meal, I eat some form of protein with it. This morning I had some blood sausage with eggs and a glass of milk and some sourdough bread and veggies, right? And then for lunch I would have maybe some ground beef and some vegetables and some potatoes, right? So like every meal, I won't just eat like random thing that doesn't really contain a lot of protein. So I think it's important to focus on to get regular protein feedings. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have an amount, a target you're working with for you per day?
Yeah, I mean, I also lift weights, so I probably so I consume about 30 to 40 grams per meal or so, about 4 times, 3 to 4 times per day. So it's a so that's about my target that I'm working with, and but in general, I mean, like I said, it kind of depends on if you have an activity. For me, it's always in my mind in kilograms, being European. But let's say if you're 160 pounds or so, right? You probably want to eat like maybe 100, 120 grams of protein, especially if you're fairly active. Yeah. So I would say don't obsess over it, but also don't ignore it. And I would say make it a focal point because it has other metabolic health benefits as well, right? In terms of like I said, the satiety part, just to help you prevent from being, and you see this in other animals as well. And it's probably true in humans as well. Other animals overeat calories to get enough protein. It's probably, assuming that we're just like any other animal, which in many ways we are. We just do maybe slightly better on a math test, but we still have those effects as well. So
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I usually make it between 80 and 100 grams a day. I'm around 120 pounds. And then that's what I was thinking too. In addition to, people who are pregnant, people who are recovering from surgery, people who are exercise, people who are aging. My thought is also that so few Americans are metabolically healthy that more protein can obviously help turn off that satiety signal and maybe help them improve metabolic health. Would you agree with that?
yeah, that's right. There's definitely strong evidence to suggest that the satiety effects in terms of fiber and protein,
Yeah.
they are quite satiating. So if you even in the simplest form focus on protein and fiber-rich foods, which would be maybe some meat and veggies, right?
Yep.
And it can be as simple as that. You're probably going to be a lot healthier than yeah, consuming
Okay.
the standard American diet. Yeah.
Perfect. And before we're going to go to the beef nutrient density project, but I'm wondering, so proteins in everything, proteins in water, proteins in waffles, proteins in, what do you think? Like, what is your view on getting your protein from processed foods? I know you're kind of pro protein powder. Me too. Some of them are necessary and even provide different profiles. But what are your thoughts on this protein craze being in packaged processed foods?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the packaged processed food is playing up on the hype that you should get protein, and therefore let's start adding some protein to waffles so that people buy your product and not the competitor's product, right? I think that's what it is. I mean, I guess it's important to sneak in protein here and there to make sure, and that can be a good way if I make you know pancakes. I don't make them very often, but I throw in a scoop of protein powder, right, just to up the protein a little bit. So it's not. I don't say it's a bad thing, for sure. But I think the bigger issue is that yeah, the high consumption of ultra processed foods. It's still like if you're, we know from various dietary studies, there's a strong association between ultra processed foods and fill in the blank on your favorite metabolic disease. There's a lot of mechanistic evidence to suggest that digestion absorption is altered, that normal satiety or hunger cues are not are overridden, so that ultra processed foods in and of itself, irrespective of calories and macronutrients, appear to have problems for our metabolic health. So um, good to focus on protein, but maybe not eat. Oh, you can make some good waffles, I think, but your average waffle is probably not with refined flour and sugar and a bunch of oxidized sunflower and you name it, right? Like just your typical ultra processed food, so containing oil seeds and refined flour and sugar. That's not really that's good
Right.
for you, irrespective if it contains protein.
Perfect. And you're not like a plants versus animal protein type of guy. You kind of think probably there should be a combination.
Yeah,
If
it should be a combination. Of course, it's easier to get protein. Typically, well, unless you make a conscious effort, right? Like, but typically the protein content of animal source foods tends to be a little bit higher, a little bit more protein dense. So for the average person, I'm not saying you cannot eat enough protein from legumes and things such as that, right? But for the average person, yes, a combination of the two is probably the best because you again get these unique other compounds with it as well. I mean, even know from studies that, for instance, let's say you have a chili and you throw in beans and beef, you actually get a better absorption of the iron from those beans because it has
yeah,
beef in there, or which we don't know exactly what the factors are called the animal factors, but
yep.
there's these things that do not appear in nutrition facts panel, but that are sort of the magic of the whole foods, right? That can help uptake more iron and zinc from the beans. And we also know plant foods. There's a concern, and this is a long, nuanced discussion. But there is a concern about, especially with high heat treatment of meats, right? Like grilling or other things such as that there's some formation of maybe compounds that are not as ideal, advanced glycation products, other heterocyclic amines and other things like that. What we find is that actually herbs and spices and plant foods can offset some of those in particular. So and beans provide, besides providing protein, provides a lot of fiber, provides a lot of um, isoflavones, which the discussion, even though people avoid that sometimes like the plague because of phytoestrogen, it's also a little bit more nuanced than that. But
Yeah.
it's so you get different compounds, and I think you can get the best of both worlds. So I would say if I just look at this from sort of the standpoint of nutritional composition, to me, looking at just what plant foods contain, what animal foods contain, it doesn't make sense to me to exclude either.
I love that. Again, I love that balanced perspective. That's very valuable. Let's talk about the beef nutrient density project. So, tell us, can you give us an overview, or I'll give you an overview. It was a project where he sought to, or you can tell me if this is accurate, source beef, ribeyes specifically, from hundreds of farms across many different types of production systems and throughout the world. You can fill in the gaps for exactly where you've sourced. and look at how does the nutritional composition metabolomics profile differ when they're in a feedlot or when they're in a feedlot light, when they're in an organic system, maybe a grass-fed system, and maybe a regenerative and very extensive system. And in doing so, you're kind of defining nutrient density. What does that even look like for a bigger project called Dan Kittredge is doing at the Bionutrient Food Association, trying to give consumers the power to identify the most nutrient dense foods so that they can choose based on what I think is the most important metric that matters for human health and probably environmental health, because I think they work together. But what do you think? Tell us, did I give them the right details? Why did you become passionate about this project? And what are the main takeaways?
Yeah, no, this is a big project, the beef nutrient density project. We started that in like I guess 2021. We started first talking, started it with in 2022. I sometimes I look back on it, and I don't know if you know the movie Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola, which was supposed to shoot for about 2 years, ended up being like 6, 7, 8 years, went triple over budget. Well, that does sum up, but it became a masterpiece. Now I won't say our work. Our beef nutrient density project became a masterpiece. That's not for me to decide, but the part of where it went over time and over budget, that part is all true. So hopefully, maybe people will see it as a masterpiece when at the end. But anyway, it was a huge project. It was but it was very exciting in the end to do that. We did make some shifts. Initially, we were doing more untargeted metabolomics. And what untargeted metabolomics does, it allows you to look at a large number of nutrients within a single analytical run. While that is beneficial, the one drawback of that is that you cannot quantify those compounds, right? Because if you want to get B vitamins and fat soluble vitamins and phytonutrients and fatty acids, they would all have to be extracted separately if you want to quantify them, because certain things are optimized for others. With untargeted metabolomics, you just do more of a crude extraction. Who cares if you extract 10% of the B vitamins, right? Of vitamin B1, you can still measure it. You can still say this one's twice as high than this one because that's equal. So we made halfway through the project, we made that shift as well. So that also, but I'm glad we did in the end, because now we have quantitative data from hundreds of samples. And then the other part of that is that we linked that. We also had farmers collect soil samples, pasture samples. We also collected field work. We also, as a comparison, collected samples from croplands, feed croplands in the eastern part of the U.S., in the Mountain West, as well as in the Midwest. And we tried to, and this was really I would say an applied study, because we asked producers from North America to submit samples. So most of the prior work had been done in controlled academic settings, maybe grass-fed, grain-fed, like think of a university feedlot and a pasture or something like that. But this, we worked directly with producers, so super grateful for them also supporting the project, and got to know a lot of people, and it's been super helpful, because farmer insights are ultimately I mean, they see these things on the ground, right? And we try to validate that using scientific principles. But what we found there essentially is that on average, grass-fed beef is higher in omega-3 fatty acids. It is higher in fat-soluble vitamins and associated nutrients like beta-carotene, as well as some other compounds as well that we get in that. It's a little bit lower in cholesterol as well, but it's directly proportional to the fat content. But the fat-soluble vitamins are a major differentiator. Omega-3s are a major differentiator. And then we also find that these phytonutrients, those polyphenols from the plants, they get converted into different compounds within the animal. Sort of mammalian antioxidants is what we typically call them in layman's terms, that may or may not have a beneficial effect on us. That's one thing that we're studying as well. And then on the other hand, we found that some minerals were a little bit higher in grass-fed beef, such as zinc and iron and selenium, but it is about maybe 10-20%. So you could argue, does that have any clinical relevance? It probably depends on your baseline intake. The phytonutrients are maybe 2 to 3 times higher. The omega-3 fatty acids are also 3 times higher. Fat-soluble vitamins are also increased. And then B vitamins actually are a little bit higher, especially B1, B5, are a little bit higher in grain-fed beef. Why? Because which foods are rich in grains, or which B vitamins are rich in grains? Thiamine and vitamin B5. So, and but another interesting finding is that grass-fed isn't grass-fed isn't grass-fed, and grain-fed isn't grain-fed either. So there's tremendous variation among grass-fed. There's
Mhm.
quite a bit of variation amongst grain-fed too. And actually, maybe this might be surprising to some people, some grain-fed samples were more nutrient-dense than the least nutrient-dense grass-fed samples. But so that's another nuance.
Yeah, and what do you attribute to that? Which nutrients? I mean, are you finding any patterns there? Like, are there phytonutrients higher because they're giving more grass, or they're grain feeding for a shorter period of time, or are there variables you're able to kind of pull out?
Yeah, that's it. That's I think is it. Also, there's legacy effects, right? Like let's say if the animal prior to going into that feedlot was on a very biodiverse pasture, we know that they start high in phytonutrients and fat-soluble vitamins and omega-3, so the drop is probably less. Consequently, if the grass-fed animal is on a very monoculture overgrazed pasture, it already is not probably the most nutrient dense. Other than that, we found farmers also that, especially sort of, it's not a scientific term, but I sometimes call them artisanal feedlots, is where people finish animals 30 to 60 days, maybe 50% corn, 50% hay, get a little marbling in.
Mhm.
We've worked with other producers as well that, for instance, put some distiller's grain or other, we had a producer that got distiller's grain from a local microbrewery. That
Mhm.
microbrewery was probably also using grains that is not high quality because they wanted to make high quality beer out of it. So sourcing from more regenerative systems already. Fed those distillers grains to animals on pasture during the finishing phase. So those are all like nuances. And for instance, that sample was indistinguishable from grass fed.
Wow.
Uh, so I think also one thing I've kind of took away from the study, and we make the case for that in the paper as well, is that maybe even though it's super common to see as grass fed or grain fed, is that maybe pasture finished or feedlot finished is a more accurate the description, because if you finish on pasture and you give the animal some access to, like I said, grain byproducts, or let's say your neighbor has crop fields and you let the animals run over the crop field, or I know some farmers that actually have both, grow both grains and have livestock. If you harvest the grains, it would make sense to put the animals on there afterwards to put some nutrients back in, grace
Yeah.
residue, but they will consume some grains, right? The grain portion of the plant. So is that still grain fat? Well, it's way different than a feedlot. It's probably closer to grass fat. So,
Yeah.
but so those are key nuances. But in general, we found that animals that were rotationally grazed on plant diverse pastures were the most nutrient dense.
Yeah, I loved that finding too, that the number of plants in the pasture, up to 10, at least last I checked or when I was involved, that seemed to increase the ALA, or the plant-based form of the omega-3s in the finished product. So I thought that was cool. And yeah, more extensive grazing periods. So, few questions, because I reread the paper, and what an evolution. I mean, from the first draft that we submitted, I mean, so the saturated fatty acids, do you think, I know that there were small changes and I didn't see that really emphasized in this latest version. Do you think that's important to say different saturated fats have different metabolic effects, and certain ones, C15 or those very long chain saturated fats were a little higher in grass-fed beef? Does that matter to you?
It may matter. It may matter. I mean, higher intakes of, much like the polyunsaturated fatty acids, the saturated fatty acids, the very long chain ones, also become enriched. Which are things like behenic acid, lactoseric acid. These are basically C18 and up, so they have a longer carbon chain. And there are associations that even the fatty acid stearic acid is maybe more neutral than, for instance, something like palmitic acid, and which is more common in grain fed beef, and it shifts a little bit towards longer chain ones in grass fed beef. It's not been studied as well as omega-3 fatty acids, but there are suggestions that people with higher intakes of very long chain saturated fatty acids, that these effects are neutral, more neutral for our health, or even beneficial for our health. So the quality of saturated fat probably matters and could maybe impact things like triglycerides or things like LDL cholesterol down the line. There's a possibility for that to happen. And we did last month complete a randomized control trial that one of my grad students, Joseph Ferre, completed. And we have initial results from that as well. And so I'm happy to share those.
Please,
Yeah,
yeah.
well, I can just jump into it. What we found is that people that ate pasture finished meat and eggs, so pork, chicken, beef, um, they have an increase in the omega-3 content of their red blood cells. And there's this long-standing idea that while you see increases in omega-3s from pasture finished animal source foods, that they are meaningless because they're quite small, right? The absolute amount is quite small. But I don't know exactly where this comes from, this idea, but it's probably when people repeat it, at some point it becomes true. Because if you look at the literature, there's been multiple studies out of the UK, one out of France, a few out of Australia. They all find that if you increase intake of pastured animal source foods, you can increase omega-3s in the blood of people. But if you look at an Excel spreadsheet, you think like, wow, maybe this jump in omega-3s from 30 milligrams to 60, 70 milligrams is not that meaningful on a 100-gram basis, right? And maybe that's true if we give that to you in a pill form. But this comes back to this idea we talked about earlier, this whole food matrix, that you get more bang for your buck. So it seems that getting these within whole foods raises the levels more than you can anticipate from an Excel spreadsheet. And one of the reasons why we think that is because the phytonutrients, for instance, are antioxidants. So they probably prevent oxidation of the product. They probably prevent some of this maybe oxidation, even when you maybe aid in the digestion absorption, result in the protection of these compounds better, is one of the hypotheses that we have. There's probably also unidentified cofactors that help with the uptake of this. We know, for instance, that a lot of fat-soluble vitamins and antioxidants, right? They can also help with. We know vitamin E is a very strong antioxidant as well. So these are all things that can probably benefit. So in that study, we found that you can raise omega-3s meaningfully in your blood by just eating pastured animal source foods. That's not to say you shouldn't eat fish. Fish is a very rich source of that, but it also indicates that. And it's always bigger picture, right? Like you eat fish maybe once, twice a week, but people eat proportionally more meat, milk, and eggs. So if we can have those contribute meaningfully as well, especially given the low intakes of omega-3 in our population, I think that is meaningful.
Oh, so meaningful. That's exciting. And Joseph was one of my favorites. I got to work with him and he is brilliant. And I want to have him on just to talk all about that study. But just a few details. So, did you have an arm that was eating not pastured versus
Yeah.
pastured? And for how long? And how much of each of these foods were they eating?
So this was 4 months, 4 months long.
Whoa,
So yeah, it's one of the
great.
longest trials now in this area. They were the longest trial, and we also had 80 participants. Uh,
Nice.
so so yeah, it's a big study for sure. And so we had yeah, good. What we learned from an earlier study is that while there had been some trials done about 6 to 8 weeks, we found that is probably not enough because we saw a little bit of a divergence, but more time was necessary for it to really diverge, and which we learned from a prior trial that was I think it was 6 weeks, and so having this around for 16 weeks. We were able to see that divergence. So yeah, we had a control arm that ate eggs and pork and chicken and beef from conventional systems. And what we did is that yeah, we try to mimic patterns as much as we could. So people in the morning made some eggs and bacon. They'll eat some chicken for lunch and then maybe beef or pork for dinner. So it was a little bit more than maybe some people may eat because they were eating also. Not everyone eats meat for lunch,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes people eat yogurt for breakfast. But in this case, we did ask people to eat eggs at least 4 or five times a week. They would ask them to basically get a dozen of eggs and say like, hey, can consume this within a week if you can. So that would be on average like what, 2 eggs for six mornings, right? So and
Yeah.
some bacon with it, and where possible, 3 times a week. So they ate a good amount, and but yeah, what we saw was we measured this in the red blood cell composition, and the average American has an omega-6 to 3 ratio in their red blood cells of about 9. It's a little
Wow.
bit lower than the plasma. The plasma is about 15 or so, but
Okay.
in the red blood cell, it's a little bit lower. It's about 9. And the control group, while we're in Utah, and I want to maybe believe that we're in an agricultural community, that so there's more longevity here in Utah, and I think people are a little bit, on average, a little bit healthier. But our control group had an omega-6 to 3 ratio of about 5 in their red blood cells at the end of the
Wow.
study, but it dropped to about 2.5 in the 2.5 to 3 in the Pasture group. So they had a quite a considerable improvement.
So like a halving. So the one with the omega-6, or of 5, they maintained that 5 to 1.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay. And
yeah.
then you halved it. And if you look at, some researchers believe you want a 2 to 1 and below, 4 to 1 and below. Is that still what you kind of believe?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. And a lot of that is based on the plasma as opposed to red blood cells. In red blood cells, it's a little bit lower already. Like I said, because the average American has about 9 in the red blood cells. But yes, and mainly, why did the omega-6 to 3 ratio drop? This was mainly driven by an improvement in the omega-3s. Basically, a lot of the omega-3s doubled. So EPA, DPA, and DHA doubled. And I think one thing that's often forgotten in these discussions is we focus on EPA and DHA, but DPA, docosahexaenoic acid, is also an omega-3 fatty acid, and it's actually particularly rich in terrestrial animal source foods, so things that walk on land.
Mhm.
And it has beneficial effects in and of itself, but it also can act as a sort of a storage depot to EPA and DHA. It can especially be rapidly converted to EPA in particular. So if you don't take that into account, which is one of the more dominant ones actually, then yeah, you're kind of missing an important aspect. So that's why I think what you typically see is that the EPA rises more than you can determine from the EPA composition of that food, because you have DPA that can be also an omega-3 fatty acid. It can be converted to EPA.
Yeah. Did you do any analyses, like how many milligrams of total omega-3s did you see in the various types of foods they were consuming, or was that not measured?
Yeah, that was measured. Yeah, so in the paper we'll also have a table with all the omega-3 contents of that, and
Right.
yeah, they did roughly 2.5 times more omega-3s than as a result, and mainly because of DPA, EPA, and DHA. Even though ALA, because the plant precursor, right, and that's animal source foods still contain ALA a lot. In fact, it's the dominant one still. It's also very dominant in our bodies because, as an animal that is well, either an herbivore or in this case omnivorous, right? But eat a lot of plants. You still get a lot of those plant compounds in there. So right, that's what it
Yeah.
is. We're reflective of that. Animals typically reflect the plant and sort of the animal, if that makes sense. Whereas a plant reflects a plant, right? So we found that yeah, the intake was about 2.5 times higher.
Okay, that's perfect. And then also, this is something I want to talk about later, but we're going to just put it in here. So the omega-6 to 3 ratio of typical pork and chicken is higher than even grain-fed beef. I don't know what you're working with over at your lab, like 10 to 1, 21, 30 to 1 I've seen with pork sometimes. Did you measure those? Do you have that data?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, like the conventional pork and chicken indeed was about 18 to 1, 20 to 1.
Okay.
Um, with some of the eggs, we sourced some of the eggs from Miller's Biofarm because we had tested them in the past, and we found that those were amongst the lowest.
Nice.
Why is that the case? Well, they feed barley, peas, oats, some kelp, some fish meal, and that's really once you start to bring the omega-3s up. So there's an omega-6 to 3 ratio of about, I think it was about 4 to 1 in the eggs. So
Yeah.
that's pretty low. The chicken was also very good. We source a lot of that from Brown's Ranch, Gabe Brown, which is a very well known. And well, Paul Brown is his son is
Yeah.
really, and Jasmine are really leading the farm. So they had a good ratio as well. We worked with Thousand Hills, was also one of the partners that sourced a lot of pork, that we source pork from and beef from. So yeah, the omega-6 to 3 ratio was improved and in those, and on average it was. And I mean, it's not that surprising that the blood reflects like this 2.5 times increase on omega-3s, because that's also a lot of what was reflected in the animal source foods, and they were basically, we asked people to not consume fish, which is another very common source. And of course, we didn't have any restrictions on per se ALA, but we do know that the ALA conversion in terms of EPA is, maybe 5% or less, and in terms of DHA, maybe 1% or less, right? So
Yeah.
the contribution of that is, and it's probably even a little bit lower if you're eating a good amount of omega-3s,
Nice.
because it's also something that gets increased if you don't eat a lot of DPA, DHA, and EPA. But if you eat a good amount of that, the ALA conversion would probably also, it would be a little bit lower to begin with. So we did see that the animal source foods were driving that.
Yeah. And did you restrict seed oils at all? Or
No, we did not restrict seed oils. No,
you
no.
just let people eat as they're normally eating? Okay,
Yeah,
great.
we just said like, here's all your animal source foods, and eat these, and don't buy it at the grocery store anymore. And we did ask people if they could at the end, and Joseph will know this better than I do, but whether they thought they were eating grass fed or grain fed, and because there's a flavor difference, right?
Did they know? Did they know?
Some people would, yeah, some people would, and they would say like, oh, this is not like this beef doesn't taste like I would normally taste. And because there's studies on that. Because we, especially in grass-fed beef, you might taste some of the nuances. I mean, this is maybe we're moving to the phytonutrient profiling as well. Is that these phytonutrients, you're tasting the plant in many ways. These plant-derived metabolites. So if the animal ate, I don't know, maybe a good amount of like, let's say wild onion or something like that, or you might have like a little, or it ate a lot of something that's rich in sage or something like that, right? You'll taste some of those metabolites very subtly. So yeah, that's why I would say argue grass-fed beef. You taste the terroir, the territory, right, the environment, and those are those metabolites. So you can pick. Some people can definitely pick up on those hints.
Yes. And what I like to say is meat is a photograph of the land. And you and Fred Provenza have written review papers and studied this extensively. And like I said on the Mark Hyman show, that certain types of meat, this was lamb liver I was referring to, can contain as many like plant compounds as can something like a turnip or a squash. So I would love for you to speak to that. Where's the nuance there? Is that true? And what are these phytocompounds doing for human health?
Yeah, that's so. Yes, there is a nuance. It's not the same compounds you find in the turnip as in the animal typically. So you get a metabolism. So the animal might take those polyphenols from its forages. The gut microbiota modulate that or biotransform some of those compounds into different compounds. So the gut microbiome plays a key role in that, but it produces polyphenol-derived metabolites. And then also the liver might also further transform these things. So through sulfation, it adds a sulfate to it. It adds maybe an amino acid to it, because these phytochemicals, they like to hang out with a partner. It could be a sugar, it could be an amino acid, it could be like a sulfate. This is typically how you see it, and how we see it in our body as well. So, but it is true that liver, especially because that's where a lot of these things are biotransformed, do accumulate a good amount of those phytonutrients. And what's really interesting is that ruminants obviously consume plants that we do not consume in many ways, especially when they're out on pasture. So they may take up some unique compounds from plants you would otherwise not have access to, but they also transform various other compounds into phenolic metabolites that are actually quite similar to the forms that you would find in our body. So you have a certain level of pre-processing. Now, I certainly want to point out that in general, plant foods are a stronger source of phenolics, but animal source foods can further raise that, and they can provide very unique, potentially medicinal compounds, or at least we know from medicinal plants that we would otherwise not be able to consume. And we just wrote a very long research review paper on that. It was, I think it had like 300 references or something like that. It was a beast to proofread as well. I think I had to stop 3 times always and do it over 3 days because you want to proofread, you want to make sure you cross all your dots and your T's. And but basically yes. And and what this idea also comes from is that in the past, if you try to measure the same compounds in the plant as in the animal, and we learned this the hard way at the Beef Nutrient Density Project too, you're not going to find them. So you might find this high amounts of this compound, and you profile in the beef, and you're like, interesting, it's not there. And a nuance of that is that maybe in the previous literature, sometimes people reported these to be there. So let's say you have the compound benzoic acid, which is a major phenolic in plants, in green plants. If you then try to measure benzoic acid in the meat, by that time it has become 3,4 dihydroxybenzoic acid, 4,5 dihydroxybenzoic acid, hyporic acid, picresol, like different compounds. And especially since we're using a mass detector, more advanced techniques nowadays, we can measure the mass of those compounds. So the mass is not the same as the parent compound anymore. But in the past, what people done, they looked at UV vis, so UV light absorption. And that does not distinguish between mass. So you can have, so it's not per se the previous work was wrong, but they found benzoic acid and found benzoic acid here, but they didn't really know exactly which form it was. And then we measured that parent form. We noticed that that was not the case. So that was another nuance to the Beef Nutrient Density Project, where we set out to study this based on prior literature, and then found out as we started, it's like, it's not here.
Not in the same form. It's there.
Not in the same form. That's right.
Transformed version. I love that. So if you had to hypothesize, and maybe you've done a little more research, or seen this, what does that matter? Like, we're taking unique compounds. Is it enhancing the diversity of our microbiome? Is it translating to less or more satiety? Is it reducing inflammation levels? Can you kind of like noodle? What do you think the benefit would be to humans?
Yeah, I don't know yet, to be honest with you. It's really hard to say. We're doing some now profiling studies where we look at, now we've identified those compounds in the meat. Can we see the same compound in our body? But if you have a compound like hyporic acid, which is basically produced from polyphenols, if I eat blueberries, I also produce these from polyphenols. So it could have an additive effect. There's also other nuances to that, other compounds that maybe are very unique that we would otherwise not get. So those are things that we're trying to measure now in the human body. What I do know, and pretty confidently stating, is definitely benefiting the metabolic health of the animal.
Yeah.
So the animal's definitely healthier. The animal has less oxidative stress, less inflammation, better glucose metabolic health, better mitochondrial health, better liver health. The animal is healthier.
Yeah.
Whether eating a healthier animal makes us healthier, that we don't know yet.
Okay, but you've started to study that. And I remember when I heard about this kangaroo study where they gave kangaroo from pasture versus feedlot-fed beef, and then they measured inflammation levels afterwards, and they found that it was significantly different in favor, lower with the pastured kangaroo. But of course, that's confounded. So when I was there a few years ago, you were doing plant-based burgers versus regular burgers. You were doing a number of human clinical trials. Can you just give us talk about some of your favorites or the most surprising, or just you think would be the most relevant to a consumer?
Yeah, we replicated that study, and we matched for fat, because that kangaroo study, they fed a lot less fat in the kangaroo versus a Wagyu beef, which is really fatty beef.
Right.
So we replicated that with a plant-based burger. We also fed grain-fed beef and grass-fed beef, matched for fat, and we did not find a difference in acute inflammation after the meal. It was the same amongst all groups.
Okay.
So that did not matter in that sense.
What is acute? Like, what time period are we working?
It was 5 hours, afterwards. So we basically replicated that kangaroo study, and we did not find a divergence between the protein source that you measured. What we're looking at now is looking at the postprandial metabolome. There's been some work out of Montana State that found differences in the metabolome after eating. So the circulating metabolites, because we know grass-fed beef contains different metabolites than grain-fed beef, so the blood reflects that. It's very hard to say on one meal, right, whether this has a long-term health benefit. You cannot say that. But what you can say is like, okay, well, at least if you eat grass-fed beef and grain-fed beef, your blood is going to look different afterwards because of the different compounds. Maybe that's not so surprising, but that's one of the findings. And we are looking at now that we completed this longer-term trial. So in the short term, we didn't really find a difference in inflammatory markers. We're now studying long-term. And what we did find in that study that Joseph did was in our group, and a variety of other students and research technicians, because it's a big, as you can imagine, these are huge projects with everyone's involved in the lab in that. And we found that there was an additional benefit on some of the more classic blood markers like LDL cholesterol. So there may be some, and that may be due to what we think, what we do find is, so the closest evidence we have for health benefit is that the omega-3s are improved in the red blood cell or the tissue membrane or the membrane of people. And over time, having higher exposure to omega-3s should, based on epidemiological data, is associated with a reduced risk of heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, etc. So while I cannot say that eating grass-fed beef does any of those things, right? And that's right. We cannot definitively prove, but being exposed to higher levels of omega-3 should, over time, over 20, 30 years, over a lifetime, lower your risk of metabolic disease. So that's the closest we have to, I would say, a health benefit of omega-3s. And then the other, from Pasture livestock, and you see some drop in markers that we think of classic risk markers of metabolic disease, right?
Yep.
So we find that. And then another question is this governed by increases in some of those phytonutrients as well, or other fat-soluble vitamins, right? Which is another important thing to measure. Being exposed to maybe more retinol or other things, is that beneficial? What we did find though is, but that study was a whole diet study. We did work that was funded by the Green Acres Foundation, a philanthropical organization, and we studied all foods from regenerative agriculture, all foods from conventional agriculture. What we found is that the phytonutrients on a whole diet perspective, both on the plant and animal source foods, was higher than when conventionally sourced fruits, vegetables, meat, milk, and eggs. And that translated to higher levels of that within the blood of people. So again, but this comes back to the randomized controlled trial. We cannot do a 20-year randomized controlled trial. So we can only look at biomarkers and say, well, these compounds are increased based on epidemiological data. If you were supposed to do this for 20 years, you probably would see a health benefit.
Yeah, and so I know that trial you're talking about, I think you took people from a standard American diet and put them on more of a whole foods diet. And I think at least preliminarily you reported lower markers of inflammation, several, I think, like CRP and other. And then you also took people from, with the whole foods diet and then upgraded to pastured or, more organic types of produce and animal products. And at least I think in the beginning when you told me, there were maybe like a small reduction in inflammatory markers even in that change that was not as profound as the change from the type of diet. But is that still true, or is it now that it's more just like the phytonutrients look like they're higher in the blood?
Well, both are true in the sense that just not consuming a standard American diet makes you a whole lot healthier. Just not eating ultra-processed food. And even if you start studying fruits and vegetables and grain-fed beef, you're still going to get a lot healthier than our ultra-processed diet. So that is true, and that's what we found. So but it does seem like, based on some of the blood work on more of those metabolic, or this say circulating metabolites, that you see maybe an additionally higher levels of potentially health promoting compounds on the regenerative diet. But I would say that the difference between not consuming a standard American diet and a whole foods diet is probably larger than consuming eating 90% whole foods from conventional versus regenerative agriculture. Not to say that the regenerative agriculture cannot provide additional benefits. That's at least what the data would suggest, but it's smaller. The magnitude of benefit is smaller than just not consuming a bunch of heavily refined, ultra processed foods. So
I think that's fair, right? And I think that
yeah,
makes sense. And I think what you're saying is the benefits of grass-fed versus grain-fed beef are more evident over time in larger amounts. And, still grain-fed beef, if you have it, it's better than a donut, right?
yeah, that's right. Yeah, or eating
Yeah,
a carrot is better than candy. It doesn't matter if
exactly.
the carrot was grown in a conventional system. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. One more question before I get to like my little like high speed round is just this. I remember reading a paper that you did about ergothioneine compounds in the soil. Are they potentially translating all the way up into the meat? Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's right. So we published a paper in Nature Science of Food, I think in probably was November of this year. And we were, there's this, the intuitively or at least hypothetically, and farmers observe this particularly, is that there's linkages between soil health, plant health, and animal health, and potentially also human health. But there had been surprisingly little work done to try to confirm those things. And In that work, we try to link those together. So we did more classic soil health measurements, such as soil carbon and macro minerals. We found that in general, having animals out on pasture versus growing feed crops on neighboring fields is better for soil health. Um, Obviously, the pasture looks better. There's more soil cover. I mean, it looks, like what you would consider to be more, I guess, regenerative, or and we find that you have greater plant diversity as well, of course, because pasture plants versus maybe growing a monoculture crop is also, we know that it has some beneficial effects for the soil as well. But there's also, we wanted to see if are there compounds that we can measure that can provide that linkage, that make their way up to the food web. So ergothioneine is a compound that is produced by certain bacteria and fungi within the soil. It is also only known to produce by those organisms. So it starts in the soil, makes its way up to the plant, makes its way up to the animal, and that animal can be a cow or us. But we saw that. So we saw higher amounts of that in grass-fed beef versus grain-fed beef as well. And we think that's a marker of soil health, and kind of like at least a how do you say it, a direct line of evidence with soil properties.
Yeah. Do you think ergothioneine has human health benefits if you had to hypothesize?
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of studies done on the compound ergothioneine, specifically in the context of mushrooms, because it's a fungi, so it's rich in that. But you also find these things in things like oats and wheat, and I mean, basically, you probably find it largely in the food web. Um, so yes, it does seem it has antioxidant effects and anti-inflammatory effects, and of course, a lot of this is studied within animal models and in vitro models as well. You dump the compound ergothioneine on a cancer cell, and maybe you have less cancer cell proliferation. So there's always a little bit of an inference, but yes, it does seem that the I would say the research with ergothioneine is the evidence is moderately strong to suggest that this could have a human health benefit.
Incredible. Okay, so tell all of this. So, how are you sourcing your meat personally? Like, what do you think would matter for people or would be the most impactful suggestions you have around that?
Well, I mean, I think the most impactful suggestion is to not eat the standard American diet. That's the first recommendation. Just eat some
Yeah.
fruits and vegetables.
Yeah.
But well, in my experience, and what I try to do as much as possible is especially like source locally, especially when fruits and vegetables are in season at farmers markets, because the flavor is a lot better. So it's
Yes.
more enjoyable to eat a carrot that tastes like a carrot rather than a carrot that tastes like water with a hint of carrot, right? Same for strawberries that are out of season. So I try to do that, and then apart from that, I source locally also on my dairy. A few blocks down the road, we have someone who has goats, so I
Nice.
get my milk from there and make yogurt out of it, and um, we buy a lot of our meats as well from local ranchers. So yeah, and that is grass fed or pasture raised in terms of the in terms of milk, and get our eggs as well. So yeah, I try to eat a lot of in season foods. Now, being in Utah in the winter, of course, It's all different though. We got into canning and freezing, and so it's because we grow some stuff in our own yard as well. And if you grow tomatoes, you end up with enough tomatoes for the whole village. So we eat those over the winter, and squashes and things such as that, and potatoes. So yeah, I try to source as much of regenerative as I can. And actually, I found especially it's crazy to sound, Facebook. You can, if you go to Facebook Marketplace, the amount of people that are selling their produce is
Yeah.
it's quite amazing.
I know, I love it too. Here in Colorado, you'll see people just setting out their surplus tomatoes or
Yeah.
whatever, like even in their front yard. So, say we're going to a restaurant and there's no pastured products. What are you going to order?
I'd probably order steak. Yeah, most yeah.
Because of that ratio is going to be lower than like a chicken or a pork, or are you worried about that?
No, I also like eating steak. So if I go out to a restaurant, I don't go out to restaurants that often. So if I do, I'd like a steak that's maybe seared at high
Okay.
temperature that I cannot do at home. So no, I mean it is bigger picture, right? It's not like you're gonna eat a great feedlot finished beef and all of a sudden your health is gonna fall apart or anything like that, right? So
No.
that's not the case. So yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah, and then I guess one last question. Some people will say the omega-6 to 3 ratio isn't that important. I know, but very well respected researchers will say that it is. For you personally, how tuned into that metric are you, and how impactful do you think that is overall?
Yeah, I don't know why people would say that it's not that important. I mean, I think there's a lot of like if there's one line of research that has had 20, 30 years of research behind it, is omega-3 fatty acids. And
Yeah.
that ratio is, I mean, there's a nuance to the ratio. The ratio is mainly reflective. It's lower. It typically means that because it's really the absence of omega-3s in our diet that is a big issue, more so than the because it's often means yin and yang, right? Overconsumption of omega-6 by definition you're probably going to have lower omega-3s, but really I would say the key issue is just low intakes of omega-3s in our diet.
Yeah.
That's the main issue. So and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that has health benefits. So yeah, I would argue that any way by which we can increase the omega-3s within our diet is a good thing given low population intakes.
Perfect. Okay, so that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that overview of the many, many studies you have in the work. So can you tell people what did we miss? What's next for you? Like, what exciting projects do you have going on? Because I know you and I know you have several. And where can people connect with you?
So one thing that I'm super excited about, we're also starting to do a lot more crops. We got a lot of requests in from people to study crops as well. So we're
Nice.
doing a lot of grains now, doing corn, doing also from regenerative systems, also conventional systems, doing specialty produce, berries, cherries, you name it. I always jokingly say, as long as you don't send me rocks, I feel pretty confident that we can study it. So we've been doing that. We've set our lab up, and we're going to have a bigger launch next year as a service lab, basically. So anyone from the public can submit. So it's if you go to stefanvanvliet.com, you'll find the information, and it links through the website there. So we're also starting an interactive data platform for people to compare some of that data. We're using a lot of things like machine learning as in terms of trying to predict or authenticate foods. One thing that we've worked on a lot is like, can we authenticate grass-fed beef based on the compounds that are in there? And it
Hmm.
seems that we can with a high degree of reliability.
Nice.
In fact, there were two samples in that study that were classified as um, that we knew. Well, they were labeled as grass-fed beef, but they were classified as grain-fed beef. But we knew that they were probably not grass-fed beef. So my point is that the data suggests that these are in fact are grain-fed beef labeled as grass-fed beef,
Mm.
and vice versa. Some stuff that we know we labeled as grain-fed beef because this is the guy finishing on pasture on some distiller's grain with a beautiful biodiverse pasture. Otherwise, it actually gets classified as grass-fed beef. Like the machine learning model would do that,
Right.
but we know it's not. But that becomes out this nuance is that well, compositionally it's more considered similar to grass-fed beef than the grain-fed beef. So we've been working on that, and so yeah, we've been expanding our. I know people know our work a lot for livestock, but we've been expanding our work to to crops or all foods now. And another thing that we've been working on is raising so we were studying about 300 phytonutrients, quantified 300 phytonutrients, and we plan to raise that to about 1,000 compounds over in 2026 as well.
Wow. And do you think this will eventually change labels? Like, would you like to help the label regulation and maybe create new labels?
Yeah, that's right. I think ultimately it will. I mean, there's regulations on where you can put and this is something you can already do, is put in a factual omega-3 content on front of package labeling, not the black and white, but maybe on the front of package.
Nice.
There's opportunities for that for sure. That's also one of the cases we make in the paper, because that will provide more consumer, at least you can make informed decisions, right? And
Yep.
you have it on eggs, and these contain 120 milligrams of omega-3s. Could put something like that on beef as well. So yes, I do think it has that potential, and also just to give more transparency to consumers, obviously, so that they can make informed decisions on this food contains more of this than this food, and then the consumer can decide, or the market can decide, okay, I want to support this. And one of the things that, at least feedback that we're getting from producers, is that a lot of producers, they might do direct to market consumer, or they sell into maybe certain grocery store chains. They probably intuitively know that their product is of higher quality because of the practices that they do, both within livestock as well as in cropping systems. But they don't really have a lot of justification for that, other than saying, like, hey, I think my cherries taste better, and that's it, right? And so, but then having some, at least justification as to whether that may or may not be the case. And of course, it's not always the case, but typically the reason, if a cherry tastes more like a cherry, it probably will have more things like malic acid or other polyphenols in there, other flavonoids in there that provide that flavor. So I think it helps. What we've been working a lot with farmers is that I think it helps the farmer to at least have concrete evidence or evidence-based justification that what they're doing actually has a concrete benefit. So I'm really excited about that. So we've been building out that program.
Yeah, that was a really exciting part of this project for me too, because I got to speak with a lot of the producers, and it was they were so excited about that type of evidence, because they put so much heart and love and thought into what they're doing. So thank you for that. Any famous last words, anything that you think we missed? This is your chance.
I don't know if we missed anything. No, I think we could be very good. Well, I mean, we could probably talk for another 3 hours, and we have a lot of things in the pipeline. And but no, I think we covered a lot of the high level details. And yeah, if people have any interest, I'm probably pretty easy to find online. Shoot me an email, and my website is stefanvanvliet.com, my Google Scholar profile. If people want to read more on these papers and want to dig deeper into it, we've got some exciting work coming out as well. The first part of the first paper on the beef nutrient density project just got reaccepted again. So
In the Journal of Animal Science, correct? Which is a very good journal.
yeah, it's good journal. Yeah. So that should be out. I think one of the things, and this is not like any per se related to the journal or anything, but we try to do a lot of practical work, right? And but if you get ribeyes from 300 different ribeyes, and they're all from different processors, they're gonna be trimmed slightly differently.
Yes.
And that is something then the question is, do we cut out a small piece of it from the same location? Or do we grind up the entire ribeye? Well, we wanted to see it from a consumer perspective, right? So we ground up the entire ribeye that we got and studied that. Now, that means there's differences, and some ribeyes are fattier than others. Some may have a little bit more accessory muscle, some may not. The fat around might be bigger depending on how it was cut. But obviously, as a consumer, you're not gonna dissect your ribeye right. So that's what we did, and so that was one of the things. And obviously, we could also not control how the animals were grazed. So this was really, I would say, like a really applied study, real world, but obviously less controlled. And within research, that is Yeah, I think I really like it doing applied work, and I think it's very important. And we also do very controlled trials where we have animals grazing, and it's more controlled academic setting. One group here, one group here, but in that work it wasn't. So sometimes when you send that to journals,
Yeah.
obviously it's a little bit different of what people are used to seeing. But I think one of the critiques in nutrition science, especially from sort of a consumer, right, is that, well, or even farmers, what is the real world relevance of some of the studies, right? So we try to at least strike a balance between that.
No, and I think that's so important because when they did that bronchema study and they saw that even within grass-fed beef, you had, 20 to 1 omega-6 to
Yeah.
3 ratio, all the way down to 2 to 1. And this is what people are buying. And I argue that that is the more important piece is like, how do we teach people what they need to be thinking about and what they're actually getting. So I love that element of the study, and like you said, it made it harder sometimes, but it's going to be published, and we'll share that with you. And thanks again, Dr. Van Vliet, for letting me be part of it, and also for just all of the pioneering work you're doing. I think it's some of the most important work of our time. So I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all your participation and support. We appreciate it.